Welcome to the Kung Fu Mama Show. Today we have Laura Reber. She's a highly trained school psychologist who has been working with students with diverse learning needs such as ADHD, learning disabilities, and autism for more than a decade. And she is here on our show today. And welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you here. Could you tell us a little bit about Progress Parade and what propelled you to launch it?
Of course. Yeah. Progress Parade, our mission is to provide one-on-one specialized tutoring to students with diverse learning needs. So, by diverse learning needs, I mean students with autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, any kind of learning need that might make them a little different than the quote-unquote normal. Our mission is to really meet the individual needs of every single student. And what propelled me to launch Progress Parade is really seeing that students that had different needs, learning needs, really often struggled in the school setting. Many times students have the experience of being seen in groups or not having their needs exactly met, or maybe not having access to a specialist that knows exactly what they need. So that's really the mission of Progress Parade, is to meet that need and make sure that every learner has the support that they need.
That's such a great mission. Could you tell us a little bit about what are the most common types of learning disabilities that parents might deal with today?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say the most common learning disability is definitely a learning disability in reading, which some people know as dyslexia. Dyslexia is kind of the medical term for learning disability in reading. Schools often use the phrase learning disability instead of dyslexia. So yeah, that's definitely the most common type of learning disability. It's one of our big referrals at Progress Parade. And there are definitely effective strategies and methods that work for students with learning disabilities in reading. So, if parents have a child with that diagnosis, they definitely don't need to fret. There are things that they can do to help their student. And then I would say after the learning disability in reading, there's, learning disability in math and learning disability in writing kind of follow from there. But definitely the most common is the reading challenge. And I think there's, reason for that. Reading is so important. I think math, if you're not great at math or if you struggle with math, there's kind of workarounds. Like you don't need to use math every day, or you can kind of, use accommodations like calculators and things. But reading, it's important that everybody can read, so that's something that I think gets more attention for good reason.
Great. Could you actually give us some tips about how to know that your child has a, reading disability?
Sure. Yeah, it sounds really basic, but the easiest way to know if your child has learning disability in reading is, the biggest symptom. It's not a definitive diagnostic criteria, but the easiest symptom to recognize is trouble reading. That's, it sounds really obvious, but students that are having trouble learning to read, that's the biggest symptom. If your child is struggling to learn to read, then definitely bring it up to your teacher or your school to see if they have any suggestions or, to give any opinions. And you can also seek, and this is something we can talk about more if you want, about what the different options are, but parents can also seek outside evaluations too and outside support outside the school too. So there's kind of two different routes you can go if you do suspect your child has learning disability. One's in the school and one's outside of the school.
But how early can you detect that?
So before school age, we usually don't encourage parents to look at learning disabilities. So definitely not before like first grade. I would say if you're looking at an actual learning disability, there is a disability called a developmental delay that, students can get services for that disability earlier than school age. And definitely don't wait to get support. Like if you're noticing that your child has, trouble speaking or learning to speak, or trouble socializing, or trouble with like motor skills, like are having trouble, just like, siblings or friends are able to dress themselves or do other kind of motor things that your student's struggling with, then definitely still get an evaluation before school. But a learning disability diagnosis really isn't appropriate until their school age. But that
Yes.
doesn't mean they couldn't get support and services, and that you shouldn't seek help if you're noticing concerns before that. But yeah, until they're learning to read or learning math, that learning disability diagnosis wouldn't really be relevant.
So do you deal also with like preventing learning disabilities?
It's a great question. Yes, we do. So there's a whole kind of model being developed, not just in the U.S., but outside of the U.S. too. I'm based in the U.S., so I'm kind of know most about the school systems here.
Mm-hmm.
But called responsiveness to intervention. It's a fancy term for basically saying, let's reach kids before we diagnose them with a disability. Let's reach kids as early in their journey as we can. So let's try to prevent learning disability diagnoses. So that model that's really in most of the schools in the U.S. It
Mm-hmm.
really says that let's identify the kids early. So if your student's struggling, let's give the whole class some screeners. Like for example, in reading, let's screen everybody in reading, like just a quick screener of a minute or two to see where their reading skills are at. And then if we notice concerns, let's plug them into groups so that we can give them what's called a reading intervention. It's a fancy term for basically tutoring. And then if they can respond to that reading support or intervention, then a lot of times a disability diagnosis can be prevented. And same thing here at Progress Parade. If parents suspect that their child might be struggling with reading, then get them specialized support, get them that help. And then if they're making progress, then potentially they don't need that diagnosis, whereas they might have received it if you didn't get them that help.
Do you feel that there's actually overdiagnosis of these disabilities at all? Or do we overly parent in that way to say, oh, my child's got a problem, and we label them with this, having a learning disability when maybe they don't, or they were just struggling that day or something?
Sure. I can take that question in a lot of different directions. Like, I think learning disabilities are for sure overrepresented in certain populations. Like many things, unfortunately, Black students are disproportionately labeled as having learning disabilities. Students that are second language learners are disproportionately diagnosed. So there is definitely factors beyond learning challenges that come into play with a disability diagnosis that we definitely need to work on and be aware of. And it's very interesting to see how different parents approach disability labels. Like,
right.
I definitely encounter parents who really want their child to have a disability label, even if their child is kind of average, like not really struggling, like they really think something's wrong or want their student to be much higher than average. And so they're looking for some reason that they're not where the parent wants them to be. That definitely happens. And then there's other parents who the kid really needs the help and they probably do really have a learning disability, but the parents wants nothing to do with it. They really don't want to acknowledge it or admit it. And then for that reason, the child doesn't get services. So it definitely goes both ways as far as parental acceptance and parental view of the disability.
Definitely. So could you tell us a little bit about ADHD as a learning disability and how do we detect that?
Yeah, so ADHD is actually really separate from a learning disability. They're two different things. So ADHD is, a disability that deals more with inattentive behaviors, like having difficulty focusing, spacing out, having trouble completing your task that you're trying to work on. That's one type of ADHD that's more inattentive. And there's also a hyperactive type of ADHD where it's more like what people think of when they think of ADHD. A lot of times a student could have ADHD and you would never know it. I mean, from observing them, because they're just kind of spacing out and not causing any problems. But hyperactive type is more likely to be bothering people, so out of their seat, moving around, fidgeting. bothering their peers.
Right.
So ADHD can cause learning challenges, but it's not a learning disability per se. It really is a separate disability that has to do with inattentive and hyperactive behaviors and the consequences of that. So sometimes that's academic challenges. A lot of times it can be challenges with completing homework, turning in homework, and that can really impact grades and school performance.
Right.
Yeah. So it really is a separate issue. A learning disability, doesn't really have anything to do with hyperactive behaviors or inattentive behaviors. It has more to do with struggling to read or struggling, to learn math or writing. So they are separate.
I see. I think a lot of parents are not really sure about the distinction. I think you made it very clear. I mean, that's great for us to all know.
Yeah, I think it's confusing. A lot of parents think it kind of lump it all under learning disability. And we've talked about several different things already today. We've talked about developmental delay, which has more to do with young kids not meeting their developmental milestones. And that definitely needs intervention and support. And then when they get into school, and ADHD can also be diagnosed in young kids, whereas a learning disability really shouldn't be until they're in school, because there's nothing that to compare them to for learning until they're learning to read and learning basic math and stuff like that. Before that, it would really be a developmental delay instead of a learning disability.
But really, in layman's terms, when you have a learning disability and your child is in school, you find they're having difficulty with reading or math, or is it really that you just tutor them, just give them more attention in those specific areas?
Yeah, I mean, there's no magic out there, So when a student has learning disabilities, the best thing to do is get them support, whether that's specialized support, whatever the school is offering your student, or whether you choose to pursue outside support. It really is just getting your student a specialized academic instruction that really, ideally with somebody that knows something about their disability and can respond with the research and knowledge about what typically works for students that share that disability. So
is that something also that Progress Parade helps, parents determine?
Sure. Yeah, we don't diagnose disabilities. But to be honest, we don't need a disability diagnosis to help a student, So sometimes parents are like, oh, should I get a evaluation before I come to you? And it's really not necessary. I mean, our tutors don't need the diagnosis to figure out what a student needs. I'm not saying the diagnosis, exactly. If a student goes in to get an evaluation, I'm not saying that's not helpful. The parents learn something usually from that, but it's not necessary to get help. Yeah, I mean, if you come to Progress Parade and say, hey, my student's struggling to learn, should I get an evaluation before I get support? I would say no, let's just give your kid what they need academically, and then you can decide what you want to do from there as far as an evaluation or a diagnosis.
I see. So what are some actions that parents can deal with the school? I mean, does the school actually help with these kind of learning disabilities, or do you find that sometimes the school system is difficult to deal with in this aspect?
So the school system, at least in the U.S., is legally obligated to support students with disabilities. So yes, they should be providing support to all students that have disabilities in some way. If they need it, for example, a student might have a mild disability and they really are accessing the same thing as their peers at school. So they're able to complete all the same stuff their peers are able to complete. They're able to participate. In that case, the school doesn't really need to do anything, because they are, even if they have a diagnosed disability, if they're doing well at school, then no need to, fix it if it's not broken,
Of course, yeah.
But if the student's failing or struggling or way behind grade level or getting into having lots of behavioral challenges, then they do need, legally, at least in the U.S., they do need to do something about that. So they should be getting support. You don't have to search very far at all to find parents that are really dissatisfied with the support that their students are getting when they have a disability. There's a huge amount of variety across schools and across areas with the quality of the services. And so there's a lot of parents that end up taking legal action. There's a process here in the US called due process that students can go through if the parent feels that the child's needs are not being met, and then they can actually take legal action and potentially get some kind of not money compensation, but compensatory services. So basically what that means is, like, say your student should have, if you go through this due process procedure and they say, yeah, really the school messed up, then sometimes the school will have to pay for services that they missed out, that the student should have gotten that the school didn't provide.
So what about the support in terms of actually having students of autism, ADHD? Do they have actual special schools, and how is access to that?
Yes, there are special schools for every diverse learning needs, even learning disabilities, autism, developmental delay. There are schools that address the learning needs of young students and all around behavioral, speech, academic, everything. And, parents, similar to kind of what I talked about with access to a diagnosis, like you can go the public route through the school, or you can choose the private route to privately pay for an evaluation. Same thing for the schools. Like, clearly you can go to whatever school you want if they accept you and if you privately pay for it. If you're the schools will pay for what they're called outside placements. So, for a placement outside of the school district in one of these specialized schools, but it definitely is a process. Like, for that to happen, like, usually the school district fights it a little bit because they're not cheap, and usually there's a lot of hoops to jump through, but it does happen, for students who have really specialized needs. And we've even had school districts, especially this past year and a half during COVID, we've even had school districts end up paying us to provide intensive services because the most specialized instruction is always going to be one-on-one, instead of like a classroom setting. So, it does. School districts, I guess I'll just say, to answer that question, it can be accessed in multiple ways, and there are definitely specialized schools that address individual specific needs.
So can you tell us a bit about some of the students that you've been tutoring, or your company has been tutoring? Are there any cases that you'd like to share about, I guess, success stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually just reviewing in our database, we always keep like client notes and progress notes, and I was just reviewing that today because I was feeling a little bit discouraged just about the ongoing COVID stuff. And like, it's just tiring, it's tiring to live during this time in a lot of ways. So yes, I was reading about just how a lot of parents have said, that they feel that their tutors are not only tutors, but sort of therapists. To be clear, we're not providing therapy. We're not therapists, but, but that's how the parent felt, that their tutor was really providing tons of academic support. Or social emotional support in addition to the academic support. I was reading a lot of like just parents saying not only the academics improved, but also really seeing the child's confidence improve and their attitude improve. And that was really great to see. So, we see a lot of really happy parents, a lot of, I think a lot of parents have been through the ringer when they've been through really tough times when they have a student with a diverse learning needs. So to really be able to just approach us and get that one-on-one specialized support and not have to jump through a bunch of hoops or, or do so much advocating for themselves, I think is a big relief.
Yeah, I think also there's sort of a stigma, about learning disabilities and parents just realizing that they need to get help, and whether they are going to make that step or not. I think a lot of, especially in Asia, they really care about face. In Asia, everything's face. Whether there's a stigma between having a learning disability, and I feel that needs to be talked about more.
Sure. Yeah, I think stigma is a problem in all areas, including this one. I think stigma really prevents people from getting help, and like the earlier the better. Like if a parent's noticing a struggle, you don't have to go out and get a disability label for your kid. Just get them some help, and a lot of times, like that will solve the problem. But I think parents are worried, like, well, why does my kid need help? Like maybe
Right.
they'll just grow out of it. Like maybe it'll just go away, and that's not usually what happens. The research is really clear that problems tend to get worse when they're not supported in academics. So I hear parents all the time that call us and say, well, the teacher said, let's just wait and see if they, maybe next year they'll grow out of it. And I'm always like, please don't do that. Like, please just get them some help. I'm not saying you have to hire a progress parade, but do something, don't wait, because an ounce of prevention really does go a long way towards preventing not only academic problems, but also, students notice that they're struggling, that they notice early that they're not reading at the same rate as their peers. And then that starts to really impact their attitude about school, so
Right.
you really want to prevent all of that if you can.
And psychologically, what that does to you, to feel that you're failing, I suppose.
Yeah, and eventually a lot of those students do end up like really disengaged from school. Those are the kids that you hear later saying, I don't care about school, I hate school. It's much cooler and less risky to your like self-image if you just don't care than if you're bad at it, so a lot of times that's kind of a defensive approach that kids take when they've struggled with school, is to say, I don't care about it, I hate it, I hate school, I don't care, because it's, when you're feeling bad about yourself, it's just easier to say that than to say, like, I've really struggled and I'm bad at this, so definitely want to prevent all of that experience if we can.
Definitely. And what's a tidbit you'd like to share for all our listeners today?
Sure. I think a tidbit I would share is just kind of what we talked about with the stigma. Just if you see your child struggling with something, whether it's academic or behavior or speech, don't worry about it. Just, seek out some help. Go to a professional in that area and get a professional opinion, rather than kind of going down the Google rabbit hole and worrying about stuff that might not even be relevant. Just go out, get some help. An ounce of prevention will go a long way. And there's a lot of effective services and providers out there for all students. So
amazing. And how can our listeners find you?
Sure. Yeah, they can find us on progressparade.com. There's a book of free consultation right there on our homepage. Those all come directly to me. So they'll be talking to me if they book one of those free consultations. And then, of course, they can follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well.
Okay, amazing. And all of you listening out there, don't forget to follow at Kung Fu Mama Show at Facebook and IG, and our YouTube, Stark Sarah Chang. Thanks so much for being on the show. I had an amazing time with you.
Thanks for having me.